somewhere, right now, a person is being treated as more important than everyone around them simply because of the family they were born into. It happens in boardrooms, in politics, in old European households that still keep a title nobody asked them to keep. It feels almost natural, like it's always been this way. It hasn't. For the vast majority of human history, nobody had a king, and nobody particularly wanted one. So how did your ancestors go from having no rulers at all, to bowing, kneeling, and building entire monuments to a single person's authority? Picture early human groups, small bands of hunter-gatherers moving across the landscape together. Decisions got made through discussion, consensus, and the quiet social pressure of everyone knowing everyone else. There was no throne, there was no crown. If someone in the group started acting like they were entitled to give orders and be obeyed without question, the rest of the group had ways of dealing with that, and none of them involved kneeling. So if hierarchy wasn't the default setting, where did it actually come from? Here's the detail that reframes everything you probably assumed about this. For a long time, historians told a simple story. Humans discovered farming. Farming created surplus food. Surplus food created inequality, and inequality eventually hardened into kings. Clean, logical, and, according to a growing body of archaeological evidence, largely wrong, or at least far too simple. This is where researchers Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus, archaeologists who spent decades studying the emergence of social hierarchy across dozens of ancient societies worldwide, enter the story. Their extensive comparative research, published in their landmark study, The Creation of Inequality, found no single universal trigger. Some societies farmed for thousands of years while staying stubbornly, deliberately egalitarian. Others developed steep hierarchies without agriculture at all, built instead on control of prized resources, ritual knowledge, or simply charisma backed by force. Inequality, it turns out, wasn't an inevitable side effect of surplus. It was a choice, made and remade, differently, in different places, for different reasons. Flannery and Marcus documented something particularly striking in their comparison. Many small-scale societies didn't just fail to develop hierarchy by accident, they actively, deliberately prevented it. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have recorded specific social mechanisms built for exactly this purpose. Mockery aimed at anyone who started acting too important. Deliberate exclusion from hunting parties, even, in extreme and rare cases, the group collectively deciding an individual had become too dangerous to the community's equality to remain part of it. Researchers sometimes call this pattern reverse dominance hierarchy, the group as a whole holding power over any single person who tries to rise too far above everyone else. Egalitarianism, in other words, wasn't simply an absence of hierarchy. In many societies, it was an actively defended, continuously maintained achievement. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere, a group of people looked at a person who wanted extra power and said yes. Somewhere else, an almost identical group looked at a similar person and said absolutely not. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins documented a particularly revealing middle step in this process, studying what he called big man societies across Melanesia in the Pacific. A big man wasn't a king. He held no formal office, inherited no title, and commanded no guaranteed obedience. What he had was influence, earned entirely through generosity, hosting elaborate feasts, distributing pigs and wealth, building networks of debt and obligation across an entire community. Crucially, a big man's status died with him. His children inherited nothing automatically. Each generation, the position had to be won again, from scratch, through the same exhausting, generous, socially demanding work. This matters enormously because it shows humans clearly could build systems with real, meaningful status differences without ever locking that status into blood. The big man had power. He simply didn't get to hand it down like property. Sahlins also documented something that reads almost like a built-in failsafe against Dynasty, because a big man's authority rested entirely on continuous generosity. Hoarding wealth instead of redistributing it was, functionally, political suicide. A big man who stopped throwing feasts, stopped forgiving debts, stopped funneling pigs and goods back out to the community, quickly found his followers drifting toward some other, more generous rival. The system rewarded exactly the opposite instinct of what later kings would come to embody. Where a king accumulates and keeps, a big man survived only by constantly giving away almost everything he'd built. So what was the actual leap from earned, temporary influence to inherited permanent rule? Here's where the picture gets genuinely strange, and where researchers David Graeber and David Wengrow, in their influential re-examination of early human societies, pushed back hard against the old tidy narrative entirely. Their research points to archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a monumental complex of massive carved stone pillars built roughly 11,000 years ago, thousands of years before any evidence of farming, permanent settlement, or centralized rule in the region. Somehow, without kings, without a state, without any obvious ruling class giving orders, groups of people organized enough collective labor to move and carve stones weighing many tons. That single site quietly demolishes the assumption that large-scale cooperation always requires a ruler standing at the top telling everyone what to do. Humans, it turns out, are capable of organizing enormous collective projects through consensus, ritual obligation, and seasonal communal gathering, without anyone present who could legitimately call themselves king of anything. If large-scale cooperation didn't require kings, permanent rule had to be built deliberately, argued into existence piece by piece, and the pieces, once you know to look for them, show up again and again across unrelated cultures. Control of a genuinely scarce, essential resource, water rights in dry river valleys, the only reliable source of metal ore, or grain storage during lean years, gave certain individuals leverage nobody else could easily match, claimed access to the divine. The ability to say a particular family alone could communicate with gods or ancestors, made obedience feel less like submission to a person and more like obligation to something sacred. And military force, the blunt ability to punish anyone who refused to go along, backed up and made permanent everything the first two had already started building. Layer those three elements together: resource control, sacred legitimacy, and force, and something genuinely new emerges, a position of authority that doesn't evaporate when the impressive individual holding it dies. A son could inherit the resource stockpile, a daughter could inherit the claimed divine lineage, an heir could inherit the soldiers loyal to the family name rather than to any one irreplaceable person. That, right there, is the actual mechanical difference between a respected big man and an actual king. Permanence, inheritance, a title that survives the person who first earned it. Early Mesopotamian city-states, particularly Uruk, show archaeological evidence of exactly this transition happening in real time. Temple complexes gradually consolidating control over grain surplus and labor, priestly authority slowly merging with political authority until the two became functionally the same office. The first kings weren't strangers who conquered their way onto a throne from nowhere. Overwhelmingly, they were priests, resource managers, and successful big men who found a way to make their earned authority outlive them. Even then, the earliest kings didn't simply announce their permanence and expect belief to follow automatically. Royal inscriptions from early Mesopotamia go to remarkable lengths insisting a given ruler was chosen by specific named gods, appointed to their position before the person was even born, sometimes before the city itself existed. That's not incidental decoration on official records. It's the argument itself, repeated constantly, because the idea of permanent inherited rule needed constant reinforcement to feel natural to people whose grandparents had lived under no such arrangement at all. Legitimacy, in other words, had to be manufactured and maintained, loudly and often, not simply assumed. Think about the strange symmetry sitting underneath this entire story, the thing that feels most permanent and inevitable about human society, one person ruling over everyone else by right of birth, was actually one of the later, more fragile inventions your ancestors came up with. It required convincing enormous numbers of people, generation after generation, that inherited authority was legitimate, natural, even sacred, when for the overwhelming majority of human history, the exact opposite assumption had been the default. Somewhere, right now, a person is being treated as more important than everyone around them simply because of the family they were born into. It feels ancient, permanent, almost like a law of nature. It isn't. It's a relatively recent human invention, built piece by piece out of grain stores, claimed divine favor, and armed force, layered on top of hundreds of thousands of years during which your ancestors organized, built, and cooperated on a massive scale, without ever bothering to kneel to anyone at all.